talk on open world level design. Open world games are not new, but they have become increasingly popular. They attract players with a promise of freedom and catch the interest of publishers with their business prospect. Open worlds can be defined as games offering a vast environment where players will enjoy freedom. Freedom of movement, of course, but also freedom of selecting objectives and freedom of developing their character as they want. As a result, we can see open world games like sandboxes, big sandboxes. But for us designers, open world games are not games that are just bigger. There's something unique about those games. It is the fact that it is the open world itself that draws players' attention, not the game system. You see, in most games, the design team defines first the core gameplay, then tackles the level design. And the level design serves as a field of application for the game system. But in an open world games, the opposite is best. First, define the main features of the open world, then select the most suitable game mechanics. As a consequence, level design should be considered as more important than game mechanics. And tackling the level design for an open world is a huge task. How to start when you are facing the white page? What are the key issues to address? The solution is to ask the right questions during the planning phase. And my purpose today is to help you make the right choices when you're planning the level design of your open world games. My name is Pascal Luban. I'm a creative director and game designer, and I work as a freelance. I started working on games nearly 25 years ago, and the first AAA game I worked on as lead game designer was Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare. It was the 4th episode in the series. Then I worked as lead level designer on the multiplayer version of 2 Splinter Cell games, and a few other titles that you can see on the right pages. Eventually the market changed focus, and most of my clients asked me to work on mobile games. So for a good 10 years I worked essentially on mobile games, either as designer or consultant. During that period I did work on a few console titles as well. In particular, Activision commissioned me to work as game and level design consultant on 3 hunting games. Those games were developed by Fun Labs in Romania. Now the industry seems to be shifting back its attention to console and PC, away from casual games on mobile. So more recently, I have worked on Steam and Xbox games, and several of them were open world games. Now, when tackling the level design of an open world game, there's a key question that must be asked first. Why do we want an open world? What purpose will it serve? An open world is very expensive to develop. And it should not be a beautiful background for the game. It must serve a higher purpose. And there are 3 possible uses for the level design of an open world game. And we're going to see them now. The first use is what I call the conquest of the player's time. This strategy is central to the design of many Ubisoft titles. Its objective is to offer a huge lifespan to the game. And this is achieved by increasing the number of quests, renewing the content of the open world constantly, and supporting farming mechanism. Now this strategy offers several benefits. First of all, it gives great value to players. It's easier to spend a good deal of money if you know that you are buying yourself at least 50 hours of gameplay. Then, the longer players play a given game, the more chance there is of selling them additional content, DLC, cosmetic items, and so on. And those additional revenues have become a significant complement to the income generated by the sales of the basic game itself. So that's one of the reasons that publishers are so interested in open world games. And the third reason is that when a game is played for a long time, it remains present in the media and the minds of the player for a longer time. So that means that publishers which strengthen its brand and therefore increase the value of its IP. But this strategy also features a few weaknesses. First, the systemic dimension of the game mechanism can make the open world repetitive. We all know that. For those of you who play open world games, I'm sure you've been facing the situation. The game is fun, but after 20 or 30 hours, you keep doing the same stuff and becomes an annoyance. Second, it's also more difficult to integrate a convincing narrative into it. Why? Because such worlds which are designed for long play, are not realistic, and the storyline is diluted in countless missions. So I'll talk more about storytelling later on during this presentation. Now let's see another strategy to use the map in an open world game. The second use of the level design in an open world game is to improve immersion. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 or the first titles in the Assassin's Creed series are good examples of its strategy. The purpose of this strategy is to seduce players by transporting them to a universe that is very credible and that interests them. And this high level of credibility is obtained thanks to the attention to detail, historical references, and the behaviors of the non-playing characters. Now, the first strong point of this strategy is obviously the attractiveness of the chosen theme. Players interested in the theme of the game obviously will become potential buyers. If you're interested by the American West in the 20th century, early 19th century, obviously, you're going to buy Red Dead Redemption 2 because the game is a beautiful description of this period. This strategy also makes it easier to implement quality storytelling, because if the game world itself is credible, it's easier to build characters and situations that are also credible. The thing is that good storytelling attracts players and has shown that it can bring real added value to many games. Think of The Last of Us, which perfectly combines efficient gameplay and high quality storytelling. On the negative side, this strategy of focusing on immersion tends to make the game more complex to develop and, in that case, also more costly. Why? Why? Because the game must be filled with a lot of unique content, which is not the case in a world that uses the same assets over and over. This strategy can also have a negative impact on the gameplay itself. First, the need to make the game environment credible has an impact on the density of actions offered to the player. For those of you who have played Red Dead Redemption 2, you've probably noticed that there are less things to do when you go from point A to point B. This is like in real life. Unlike other open world games where you cannot move 100 meters without coming across enemies, animals, resources, and so on. This density makes worlds not credible. And second, it has also an impact on the evolution of skills and equipment of the player's characters. And again, that could weaken the gameplay. Again, I will talk about Red Dead 2. In that game, there's not much you can improve on the main character. You can get him better weapon, improve the horse, better equipment, but you cannot go very far. Why? Because this game is realistic. So you're not going to equip your character with a machine gun or some kind of gun. It's just impossible. And then there's a third strategy to use the map in an open world game. The map becomes the challenge. Now, this strategy is at the heart of survival games such as The Long Dark, Daisy, or The Forest. You see, in most open world games, the map is mainly used to provide resources or to stage ambushes and to give some form of environment to the missions. But it means that the map itself has no gameplay function. However, when the map itself is a challenge, moving in the map and finding resources become the gameplay. And that's the case in survival or parkour-based games. For instance, in survival games, the challenge for players consists in knowing how to get around and how to find the resources essential for survival. So the map in survival games is a central component in the game system. It is not a simple background that links quest or action scenes. The map is the gameplay. What can we say about this third strategy? Well, on the positive side, the game experience that is offered by those maps are usually better adapted to hardcore gamers, because the mechanism of survival and parkour games can be quite complex, so they offer a more hardcore positioning for the game. And then also, such games do not necessarily favor combat, so they can also seduce players who are tied by combat and those who favor cooperative gaming experiences. But this strategy also features weaknesses. First, survival and parkour gameplays can get too complex for the least experienced players. And then, especially for survival games, core gameplay tend to be the same from game to game, weakening their attractiveness. So, as you guess, few games choose a unique strategy. DayZ, for instance, focuses on strategy 3. And The Witcher 3 develops strategy 2 because it's, above all, it's an action-adventure game based on strong storytelling. The open world is actually relatively little exploited in that game. But many other games build their gaming experience by combining these strategies. For instance, Red Dead 2 mixes strategies 1 and 2, and The Long Dark develops strategies 2 and 3 in an original way by offering different game modes. First, you have the survival mode, which offers hardcore survival gameplay. It's very difficult. And then you got the Wintermute mode, which is built around a linear story that offers easier survival gameplay. So my first key learning is the following one. When preparing the map for an open world game, make sure you have a clear idea of its use. So far we have defined the purpose of the level design for our open world game. Now it's time to draw the open world itself. At that stage, the mission of the team responsible for the design choices is to define a high-level document which describes its major features. And this task can be complex for several reasons. First of all, the team has to meet the constraints imposed by the previous choice, which strategy used for the map. Then the team also has to respect the golden rules of good level design, rules that applies to all level design. And third, they also have to give proper instructions to the people that will actually build the map, the level builder. So I recommend using the following method. It's a series of questions that allows you to ask the right questions in the right order. Question 1. Do we want an open world made up of a large continuous map, or do we want to split it up in several smaller maps? Both cases exist. For instance, Ghost Recon Wildland offers a huge continuous map, and it's also the case for all the games in the Far Cry series. On the contrary, the world of The Long Dark is made up of a dozen medium-sized maps, and switching from one to the other interrupts the game for the map to load. Now, both options have their merits. The first option, the large continuous map, is more elegant from the technical point of view and more comfortable for players. No loading time. But the second option is better suited to gigantic worlds like a continent, an entire planet, or even a portion of the galaxy. When you think about it, it makes sense. What is the point of offering a huge world if it is repetitive or filled with emptiness? Second question is related to the content of the world. Do we want the map to be uniform, or do we want the map to offer different zones? The games in the Division series, Ubisoft games, offer uniform maps. For instance, in the Division 2, the game takes place in the center of Washington, D.C. So it's beautifully detailed, but it's always the same. Large streets, narrow alleys, courtyards, plaza, and building interiors. That's it. It's the same over and over. On the contrary, Subnautica features different areas, and we discover them as we unlock the ability to dive deeper and deeper. And to me, this last option offers multiple advantages. First, to fight against the monotony of the environment. That's one of the problems we have in the Division 2. Second, the possibility to introduce new gameplays. And third, better contribution to the feeling of progression of the player. Okay. Obviously, if you discover new zones and if new zone, new area are different, the player has a feeling that it's progressing. The problem with this strategy is that it's expensive in terms of graphic assets, obviously. So there's like an alternative to offer diversity to players. It is to alternate between day and night. And this approach has been implemented in DevGAMM. In that game, the map changes between day and night. Of course, the topology remains the same, but the behavior and density of mutants, the enemies, change. So it could be a tactical choice for the player to move either at night or during the day. The third question, do we want players to move freely in the map, or do we want to control their progression? Now, we can allow them to move freely in the map to go anywhere. That option is quite realistic, and it goes well with the feeling of freedom given to players in open world games. But actually, many open world games limit players' movements. For instance, in Far Cry Primal, players must unlock the grapple hook to access certain areas in altitude. Or in The Witcher 3, it is a progression of the main story that blocks access to new areas. Between these two options, complete freedom or controlled progressions, some games use a mixed system which allow great freedom of movement while discouraging players from going everywhere. This is the case in the Division 2. In that game, you have access to all districts of Washington, D.C. nearly from the start of the game. Okay? You can go anywhere by foot. But players quickly understand that if they reach certain area without a minimum level, they have no chance of survival against the enemies which are present in that zone. Like what you can see here on the map is that on the left part of the map, you've got an area which says level 21 to 25. That means that if the level of my character is below that number, I have little chances of surviving. So I better go there later on. So the benefit of this system is that basically you offer both systems in one. You can go where you want at your own risk, and you still have a strong way to control the progressions of the player. Question 4 has to do with navigation. Now, you know that good games are built around gameplays. And as you all know, good gameplay is essentially a challenge which is offered to players. Now, in action games, for instance, gameplay is related to combat. If players don't do well in combat, they fail the challenge and it's a game over. But this type of gameplay could be complemented with other type of gameplay, and one of them is navigation. What I mean by that is that navigation by itself can become a gameplay if players have to find their way around. For some games, navigation is not part of the gameplay. Those games provide navigation tools like a minimap or in-game icons that will help players find their way in a large map. So for those games, designers have decided that there's no point in complicating players' experience by pushing them to find the right path. This is the case in GTA games, where there are plenty of navigation aids. On the other hand, navigation can be part of the gameplay to find the path, to discover hidden passages, or to reach points of interest, or just simply not to get lost. For instance, in the long dark, if you get lost, you just die. You die of cold. In the long dark, players must read the environment around them to guess where to go. This is like in real life. In real life, there's no magic tool to help us find the way. Well, we've got GPS now, okay? But, if you are lost in the forest, it is so easy to get lost. When I was in Canada, I talked with a police officer in the western part of the country and explained to me that every year, people just park their car on the roadside, they walk a little bit in the forest, and then they lose track where the road is and they just die, they just disappear. It is very easy to get lost in a forest or in an environment where you don't see the star, the sky, and so on. So, getting lost, this is an important part of survival. That's why, it is very well implemented in the long dark. So no magic tool. Players in that game have to count only on their sense of observation to know where to go and to find the passages. So of course, if it's a case, designers have to give clues which will allow the player to foresee the existence of points of interest or path. For instance, on the left pictures, there's a road sign, and it makes it possible to guess that there's a road hidden under the snow. Otherwise, nobody would suspect it. And once you know where the road is located, then you know it's going to take you to a village, a crossroad, a bridge, so a point of interest. There are other ways to help the player navigate by himself, by putting streams, by having smoke in the distance, by positioning distant points of interest, like on the right image. You can see this watchtower. It's very far, but it's one way to help the player find his way because he knows that there must be something interesting there. So for those games, the topology is very important because if it's well drawn, it's going to channel players, and most importantly, it's going to reward players who show logic and have a sense of observation. Question 5 deals with an important dimension of open world maps: resources. Resources are super important for players' progression, and collecting them will drive players to explore the map and take risk. Now, there are two strategies when it comes to positioning resources. First strategy is to scatter resources more or less evenly throughout the map. Now, if you do so, you force players to explore every corner of the map to find them. The problem is that resources can be anywhere with no logic. So as a result, if you want to find resources, you just need to wander around. You'll find them, There's no decision making to take. This is why I recommend another strategy. It is to group resources around points of interest and make the journey to those points of interest exciting. You can do that by channeling movements of players and staging the path with interesting points of view, artifacts to find, encounters of opportunity, and the use of alternative means of transportation, like a zip line, for instance. Thus, going to a point of interest becomes a mini adventure in itself, rather than just being a monotonous interval. Question 6 helps you prepare the work for level designers. I'm talking here of a level design grammar. Now, a level design grammar is a set of construction rules. For instance, the level design grammar will define where players are most likely to find a given resource. For example, mushrooms can only be found in the woods at the feet of large trees. So such rules are important from the gameplay point of view, because once players have understood that a given resource can be found in a given type of location, they will not search resources randomly. They will take smarter decisions. And as most of you know, randomness doesn't make good gameplay. To make good gameplay, you want players to make smart decisions. That's how you are going to get them involved in the gameplay and make the game experience much more interesting. So the rules that can be described in levels and grammar will concern essentially the main points: appearance of resources, the location and behaviors of animals, visual clues intended to facilitate the movement of players, navigation, and size and volume templates for path and objects with which the players will interact. The last two questions to answer are a bit less important. The first one has to do with map animation. If you want to immerse players in a credible universe, it must be animated. I mean, just look around you. There's always something moving. A smokestack, a cloud, leaves, a car, okay? So it can be anything. The effect of wind, smoke, flock of birds, characters moving in the background, rain, and so on. These animations do not necessarily contribute to the gameplay, but they make the player's experience much more immersive. And I recommend to position the most spectacular ones at key locations on the map, or even to stage them by guiding the players toward them. For instance, the discovery of a waterfall can become a memorable moment and serve as a support for a point of interest. And the last rule, if possible, I recommend to plan one or two spectacular scenes. Those scenes will feed the buzz and contribute to communication on the game. And it's a good thing to plan such scenes early on because they're usually costly to develop. So, my second key learning is the following one. Find answers to those 8 issues, those 8 questions, before getting your drawing board out. You will save time, money, and you will make a more interesting map. Another important issue to address during the planning phase is the way the level design will support storytelling. Now, I believe that storytelling is becoming more and more important in action games, in particular for open world games. And I want to cover a few good practices for level design to support the narrative dimensions of the game. As a reminder, good storytelling is based on 3 components. The first one is the main character. We forget too often, but the main character is at the heart of any good story. A plot is interesting only because it relates the way a character to whom we have become attached will confront a drama. So any good narration begins with the definition of an interesting character for whom the audience will develop attachment. The second component is the plot. A plot serves one purpose only: to create the conditions for drama and to generate suspense until the last moment. And writing a good plot, this is something which is all science. Basically, a good plot still responds to rules that have been defined in the Greek tragedies. The last key component is the environment. And the environment is not just a graphic background. It contributes to the power of storytelling by providing a framework that will reinforce the drama. For instance, a story about the survival of a group of passengers would be more dramatic if their plane crashed in high altitude mountains rather than on an island in the Pacific. I think it's pretty easy to understand why. So, we have briefly reviewed the basics. Now, depending on the focus you give to storytelling, the level design of the open world will not be the same. And to illustrate my point, I will compare two games. I will compare Red Dead Redemption 2 and The Witcher 3. Now, these two titles are interesting because they are both open world games, of course, and their respective development studios have put a lot of resources into the storytelling, as you know. However, they chose two very different approaches. Red Dead 2 takes place in the American West at the turn of the 20th century. And if you play this game, I think you'll agree with me that the representation of this era is absolutely incredible. I mean, this game is nearly a simulation of that period. In that game, we follow the adventure of a group of outlaws who seek to flee the law, of course, but above all, they try to reach some kind of paradise on earth, a place where they hopefully will live in peace. Now, in this game, the plot, it's a simple thread. It's largely a pretext to justify the journey of the group and the main game missions. The narrative effort is mainly based on non-playing characters and the way they interact with Arthur, who is the character controlled by the player. Rockstar paid a lot of attention to the secondary characters, their appearance, of course, but also their personality, their way of expressing themselves, their morality, their motivations, and so on. And these characters are very, very credible. We spend a lot of time with them and end up developing real feelings toward them, either affection or dislike. So, like in a TV series, the developers of the game have focused on the characters, not the plot. And that's a rare move in the video game industry. As a consequence, the impact of storytelling on level design itself is low, except on one point, the environment, which, as we say, is almost like a simulation. Now, let's take a look at The Witcher 3. In that game, the developers made different choices. They focused on the plot and the environment. Let me explain. The main plot is better constructed than the one in Red Dead 2. It is built around a long-term objective, the search for Yennefer, the love of the hero. And the plot actually is well written. It involves interesting twists, and contrary to many games, the secondary quests are often quite interesting. Those secondary quests get us to meet touching characters and sometimes heartbreaking family situations. Now for the environment. It is carefully crafted. It's a land of wars and soldiers. But the places and landscapes are not spectacular. We are far from the epic backgrounds that we can find in The Lord of the Rings. However, the world of Witcher 3 is quite credible. This game is a realistic representation of a European Middle Ages country ruined by wars. And this is reflected by the behavior of the characters encountered. Whether they are simple peasants, we meet a lot of them, warlords, monarchs, after a few hours of play, we are taken by a very special atmosphere. It's a mixture of despair, cruelty, but also of humanity. Now, the characters, for their part, have less depth because they tend to be stereotypical. We've got the dark and taciturn hero, we've got the mentor full of wisdom, the warrior companion, and so on. So we are less attached to them because they lack thickness, and the game does not offer enough opportunity to get to know them better. So in The Witcher 3, the impact of storytelling on level design is major. It dictates the mood of the environment, and its mission drives the construction of the map. This is quite different from other open world games, where the environment is built first, then the design of the missions are adapted to existing landscape. It is important to understand this difference. Either you build your mission first and then you do the landscape, or you build the landscape first and do the mission in seconds. Obviously, the first option is better. So this is my third key learning. The content of the map in open world game will be different, depending on the focus of the storytelling. And I will briefly conclude this section devoted to storytelling with a few good practices. First of all, now we know that good storytelling is built around the main character. And of course, this rule applies to video games as well. So the first step is to develop main characters to whom players will become attached. For that, we have to give them thickness and make them credible. Then they must be thrown in personal crisis. And no need to give them the mission to save the galaxy to make their quest exciting. We can do it simply by threatening their loved ones. And once players have taken for themselves the drama of the main character, their engagement in the game will be overdriven, even if the game only offers repetitive quests and game mechanics that focus on farming. So what I mean here is that if you manage to build a strong character and give him interesting motivations, you are guaranteed to get your players more involved in the actual gameplay than simply lining up missions, after another. Another good practice is to build missions around dramas experienced by NPC, non-playing characters. All open-world games offer missions to players. They're not always interesting and appear most often for what they are, simple pretexts for actions. But if the creative direction of the game gives importance to the narrative dimension, then much more attention must be paid to the content of the missions. It makes sense. For instance, when players are moved by the distress of non-playing characters during an encounter, they will become much more involved in the mission related to those characters. And The Witcher 3 offers magnificent examples of such missions. Another good practice is to take the time to write missions and to script them like mini adventure. The interest of carefully scripting a mission is to control what players will experience. The game pace, the diversity of location, interesting tactical situations, the presence of difficulty peaks, dramatic narrative twists, and situations presenting moral choices. Level designers should stage the missions that will bring to players. In particular, they can get players to go through missions whose course is not predictable. Here, it's a way to cross the skills of level designers and scriptwriters. And to me, one of the best examples are the missions of Stalker, the shooter developed by GSC Game World. It's not an open world game, but missions are absolutely beautiful. Finally, my last best practice is to be very careful with mandatory missions. The thing is that if you decide to make your open world into a true sandbox game, okay, in that case, make sure that there are no mandatory missions. Why? Because mandatory missions could block players in their progress and frustrate them. So, my conclusion, designing a map for an open world game seems like a formidable task. But if you ask yourself the right questions during the planning stage, before you actually draw the map, you increase your chance to turn the map into the star of the game. Now, thank you very much. Just for your information, I have a monthly blog, and if you're interested, you can subscribe to my Twitter account, and I will inform you when I will publish a new blog entry. Thanks again, and good evening.
And here is a question from Arseny Dereglazov. How exactly do you facilitate cooperation between narrative design and level design teams?
Okay, first I want to say hello again to everybody. Now I'm really live. I also want to thank you for your very nice comments. I'm very happy. I try to share my experience with people, and it's always a pleasure when I can be useful. So this is a very interesting questions, and actually it's very difficult because getting story people and game designer people to work together is like mixing oil and water. It's very difficult. They have two different cultures. So there are two solutions. The first solution is that you train the game designer or your level designer to understand what good storytelling is. And then you've got people on the narrative team, they understand the game design issue. If those two teams have knowledge enough of the other side, and if they are smart enough, then they can cooperate. It's not easy, okay? But it's possible. The other solution is to use what I call narrative designer. Those people are trained in both game design and storytelling art. And actually, I think that that's probably a new job we'll be seeing more and more in teams, because a narrative designer understands both what is a game design and what is a story. So you see, there are two solutions. In my case, when I did work with narrative people, I worked with just one scriptwriter, so it was easier to handle. But when you've got two teams, then it can get very complicated. And the only solution I see is just to train each team to understand what the other team is doing.
Mm-hmm. I see we don't have any questions. Thank you, Pascal, for your speech. I hope we will see you at Minsk, DevGAMM.
I'll be looking for, yes.
And come back to DevGAMM again. Thank you very much.
Sure, yeah. Thank you very much.